Thank you very much for waiting. We would like to resume the conference. Session 2, Beyond Hub and Spoke, Can Multilateral Framework Save the Region? Professor Oba, who was supposed to be the member of the session, will be absent. From the right-hand side, Professor Shiraishi, the Chancellor of Prefectural University of Kumamoto. Senior Vice President for Asia and Korea Chair, the CSIS, Dr. Victor Cha, and Dr. Michael Green, the CEO of the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney. So, Dr. Green, please.
Begin the session, please.
Thank you very much. And I hope that Oba-sensei, if you're home in bed watching, that you're feeling better. And we miss you, but we'll do our best. This morning, I became the moderator, but Nikkei Shimbun gave me permission to also be a speaker. So I may say a few comments in addition to asking very difficult questions of Professors Cha and Shiraishi. I've lived in Australia now a little bit over a year, and it has been fascinating to watch how America's alliances look when you're in Asia. And it's also been fascinating to watch what many Americans don't realize is happening, and that is the deepening of trust and ties among American friends and allies. Japan and Australia in particular, as the defense minister said, but also Australia and Korea, the Philippines and Japan. This lattice work, as the administration calls it, is an enormous benefit for Japan. In fact, I would argue Japan is the most important hub in this architecture, very important for the US, very reassuring for the region, but somewhat new as an element in the international relations of the Indo-Pacific. So we're going to try to make sense of it today with Professors Shiraishi and Cha. The current evolution of relations among allies, partners with common interests in a free and open Indo-Pacific, it's based on a recognition that the power dynamics in the Indo-Pacific are multipolar, not bipolar. About 10 years ago, China's leader Xi Jinping proposed to President Obama that the United States and Japan form a new model of great power relations, so that the United States and China would compromise and settle issues, ignoring Japan or India or Korea or Australia, but as the two big powers would decide the future of Asia. And this was obviously very advantageous for China, because if China can get Japan out of the room, Korea out of the room, Australia, India, the Philippines out of the room, and just negotiate with the United States, the power and influence equation shifts in China's advantage. But at the time, within the Obama administration, very senior members of the president's team, not President Obama himself, but quite a few prominent members of the team were very attracted to this idea of a new model of great power relations, of a G2, of a bipolar approach. When the American people were asked about it in public opinion surveys, almost half said it was a good idea. That was 10 years ago. Today, when the American people are asked the question, is our future with China or is our future with Japan and other democratic allies? Today, by 2/3 or more, the American people choose Japan. And choose our democratic allies. And I've often said that the reason for this is first and foremost Xi Jinping. He deserves the gold medal. But the silver medal should go to Abe Shinzo, who showed the importance of harnessing multipolar power, of working with the Quad, of working with Australia and the US in a trilateral way, in building strong ties to the Philippines. The hardest for Prime Minister Abe was Korea, but as we know, and we'll hear from Professor Cha, now the Korea piece of the puzzle is really falling into place. This is good for the US, it's good for Japan. I would argue it's good for China. I would argue this stabilizes the competition with China because the US now needs allies more than ever, and Washington has to listen. When the White House put out its Indo-Pacific strategy early last year, the document mentioned allies and partners 33 times. I counted 33 times. It mentioned China 4 times. Washington has to listen to allies, and I think that will stabilize and moderate to some extent competition in a way that a bipolar US-China dominated formula might not. But there are big questions that still lie before us. How far will this networking of bilateral alliances proceed? Will the Korea piece continue to be strong? Is it effective in terms of reinforcing peace and security? Is China changing its behavior because of this growing network of allies and partners? And if there's a crisis, would these be useful? Would they be effective? Would they work? So these are big questions we want to unpack. I have some questions here from the audience online already, which I'll get to. But let me turn first to Professor Cha, to Victor. To me, the most important and missing piece in this growing network of allies and partners over the previous, I guess, 8-10 years really, has been Korea. And now we see progress in Japan-Korea relations. We had the Camp David summit that President Biden hosted. You and I, you in particular, have worked on this relationship most of our careers, have witnessed, like a lot of people in this room, progress and then a collapse back into enmity. What happened? How sustainable is it? What should we watch out for?
Well, thanks, Mike, for the question. And let me just say it's a pleasure to be here at the CSIS Nikkei Forum, the 20th CSIS Nikkei Forum. Let me say, to answer the question, let me just step back and give us some perspective on this. A year ago, we were arguably in one of the worst situations in Japan-Korea relations in the history of the relationship since normalization in 1965. If we just go back to a year ago, we were at a point where Japanese company assets in Korea were on the verge of being confiscated following a Korean Supreme Court ruling. South Korea was threatening to decouple from an intelligence sharing agreement with the United States and Japan. Japan put South Korea on an export control list. South Korea nullified an agreement on comfort women with Japan. The two countries' militaries were encountering each other at sea, and the leaders of the two countries were literally on non-speaking terms. That's where we were. And that's why the Camp David summit was, I think, historically so important. The administration talks about it as being historic, and I do give them credit for it. It was an extremely important union of the three allies, the institutionalization of trilateral meetings at the leader level, the cabinet minister level, the creation of a new named set of trilateral exercises, the promise of cooperation on securing supply chains, combating disinformation, promoting coordinated development assistance. These were all really very, very important, broadened scope of cooperation that's really unprecedented. In terms of the future, again, I think we have to think about the future in terms of why we think this happened. Like, why did it happen when it did in 2023? And here I would offer 5 reasons. The first is the overall external security environment for all 3 countries. the war in Europe really changed everything. And its ripple effects in Asia have changed the way leaders think about security. In Korea, at least, many of the things that were unthinkable before have now become possible. Second is, of course, China's behavior, as we were talking about in the first panel. China's increasing assertiveness in the region, in the Taiwan Strait. For Korea, this was something that concerned them, but it was kind of a distant concern. But I think China's assertiveness in combination with the war in Europe really have changed the way Koreans look at things. As I said, the unthinkable now becomes thinkable. Third, of course, is North Korea. And their unceasing ICBM and WMD campaign, which shows no sign of abating anytime soon, no interest by the North Koreans in any sort of dialogue. And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, we now have this new relationship between Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un. Fourth, I'm sorry to say it, but I think another factor was the U.S. domestic politics at home. When I go to Korea, actually nobody asks me about North Korean nuclear weapons. They don't even ask me about Japan-Korea relations. They all ask about U.S. domestic politics and the U.S. presidential election. And I think this creates a great deal of uncertainty that cause Korea and Japan to reach out for each other. And then the fifth is obviously President Yoon in South Korea. President Biden deserves a lot of credit for supporting trilateralism, but Yoon's efforts really have been gone beyond what any previous South Korean leader has done. He did what was called in international relations theory credible signaling, because he took on arguably the hardest foreign policy issue domestically for a South Korean president and continued to push it despite it being very unpopular at home. And I want to state those 5 causes in that order because it partially addresses the question of, can this continue? And I think while President Yoon certainly had a lot to do with it, as I said, these other 4 factors matter a great deal. And they have pushed Korea and Japan in a direction of consolidating their relations, consolidating the trilateral relationship in a way that might not be the case otherwise. And so I think Yoon deserves credit in the sense he's made it happen very quickly, but I think the trend lines are there going into the future, regardless of how elections turn out in Korea.
Your last point, regardless of how elections go in Korea, I want to push you on that a bit, because the history of Japan-Korea and U.S.-Japan-Korea relations would suggest that agency, that leadership really matters. So I'm thinking of the 1998 reconciliation between Obuchi Keizo and Kim Dae-jung, and how it didn't last,
sure,
and how much of it was their leadership. And President Yoon's support rate is low for a Korean president at this point, and he doesn't control the National Assembly. Prime Minister Kishida's support rate is low. Actually, many leaders' support rate is low, Biden and so forth. But with a different leader, can this momentum continue? Is there a danger that in future elections, either in Japan or in Korea, that someone might run against this reconciliation? Because that has often been the pattern in the past.
Yeah, I mean, it has been the pattern in the past. So a couple of responses. The first is that the elections that we're talking about next April are not for the president, they're for the National Assembly. Worst case, if they lose those, they already are in the minority in the National Assembly. So he's been able to do this despite the fact that they've been in the minority, and after next April, they could still be in the minority. Second is, President Yoon, as you know well, Mike, is not a politician, right? He has never held elected office before becoming president of Korea, and I think that's actually a good thing, because he's not sort of instinctively reflexive with regard to public opinion polls as a politician might be. And then third, he has 4 more years. Korea has a single 5-year term presidency. President Yoon in his first year has shown very clearly he's not interested, he's not willing to cave to the opposition party in the National Assembly, and he's not willing to cave to public opinion polls. So I think he will continue regardless, certainly for his time in office the next 4 years, he will continue with this agenda, will continue to try to consolidate relations trilaterally and bilaterally. And in addition, if his successor isn't from the same party, as I said, these other factors, I mean, the war in Europe, what's happening in the Middle East, China, North Korea, US domestic politics creates so much uncertainty for Japanese and Korean leaders that these, I think, are very important permissive conditions that push them in the direction of trying to work with each other more than they did even a couple of years ago.
Shiraishi Sensei, so you've, in your career, done important work for government and the academic community on our alliance, but in particular on Southeast Asia and Asian regionalism. So I wanted to ask you about that. These groupings, whether it's the Quad with the US, Japan, Australia, and India, the US, Japan, Australia trilateral defense arrangements, the US, Japan, Korea, AUKUS with the US, UK, there's a lot of these. They're not a NATO. They're not a multilateral collective security defense treaty. And while there is a heavy defense security component to many of these groupings, the near-term purpose really is about, I would argue, balance of influence, trying to shape the region, keep free and open Indo-Pacific. So in the influence game, it's been interesting because China's response to this has been to accuse us of creating small NATOs and containment, as we know. But in Southeast Asia and South Asia to some extent, Beijing's narrative is that these are all the imperial powers coming together again. So the US, Japan, Australia were all parts of empires that subjected the poor people of South and Southeast Asia. When the G7 foreign ministers met and condemned China, the Global Times had this picture you probably saw with the G7 foreign ministers all wearing the military uniforms from the Boxer Rebellion. So Tony Blinken was a US Marine, Hayashi-san was an Imperial Japanese soldier, and so on and so forth. So Beijing's really tried to tap into this post-colonial, anti-colonial resentment of the imperial powers of the West. And we know that matters because you can see how opinion on Ukraine is split. So are we creating an opportunity for China? Should we not worry about it? How should these unilateral and multilateral groupings think about our strategy for the part of Asia that's contested, that's an object of influence, an object of diplomacy and Belt and Road? What's your advice for us?
ですね、まず最初におそらく
So in the beginning, what we need to think about is the ASEAN process itself is facing a major turning point in 1990s. Since that time, I think we have they are encountering a major turning point. There are several reasons for that. In South China Sea, China and some countries are disputing over territory, and some other countries are not. And in parallel with that, the American military presence is given in order to develop a national security strategy. If that's the case, some countries may think that U.S. is a threat. And also there is a conflict in Myanmar as well. Since 1990s up until recently, 2020 or so, the liberalization of commerce and trade was one big mission to integrate ASEAN countries. However, ASEAN is losing unity, and then if that's the case, ASEAN's centrality will be lost as well. That's the current situation. I myself, ASEAN +3 East Asia Summit, I wonder how these frameworks will evolve in the future. Maybe there is no one country which will destroy these frameworks, but before we knew, naturally, these frameworks will crumble and fall apart, perhaps. So what is important now? As Mike said, Quad, AUKUS, and Japan, Australia, US, Philippines, and the security dialogue involving these countries exist. So if this is the case, Australia is already effectively an alliance country. So multilateral network building, in my view, I call it multilateralism. So if we are to build something like this as a new framework and create a new network, however, this is still in the making. So in this process, maybe we will be able to have other frameworks. So perhaps the most important challenge is involving other countries as well. How are you going to engage other countries as well? So Japan, the US, and with Australia to improve capabilities of ASEAN countries, or perhaps we'll be able to cooperate providing equipment as well. I think this is an issue we are facing now. Although this is outside of my area of specialty, but regarding Korea, since Dr. Cha mentioned, which was very, very convincing, including myself, many of Japanese people in the new administration in the Korea, perhaps the direction to be pursued will be completely different. That is a concern shared by many Japanese. So the problem is, regardless who becomes the next president, we hope to see the current momentum will continue. So this is a question I have in mind. We would like to see the continuation of the momentum.
They finished translating? Do you want to respond to that? Because, and in particular, Lee Jae-min and the left in Korea did attack the government for this. Was that short-term and opportunistic, or do you think there's a danger that, if the party of the left comes in, they'll reverse the advances?
So like I said, I don't have much of a concern about the parliamentary election in April, because even if the opposition party sustains their majority, we've already clearly seen in the first year and a half of the Yoon government that has not affected his ability to enact this policy with regard to Japan and with regard to trilateral relations. I think that 4 years from now, well, who knows what the international situation will look like 4 years from now. But the trend lines right now are not very positive. If we look around the region and around the world, Middle East, Europe, and in Asia. And I think even for a progressive president 4 years from now in South Korea, looking at if we straight line project the environment today into the future, it's very hard for me to imagine that a new Korean president would say, okay, I'm disavowing the Camp David statement. I'm walking away from the U.S. Korea-Washington Declaration. I'm not going to participate in the nuclear consultative group, the new U.S. Korea extended nuclear deterrence consultation. If this is not a prediction, but if Japan and Korea under Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida reach an agreement on a Japan-Korea bilateral security declaration, like the one that Japan and Australia did in 2006, I think it was. If they were to do something like that, I can't imagine that the president in South Korea 4 years from now saying, I'm going to disavow these things. I think the Biden administration, the Kishida administration, and Yoon understand that the future is uncertain, and that's why they have worked so hard to institutionalize all of these things. As everybody here knows well, when you make a public commitment to have annual trilateral summit meetings and trilateral cabinet minister meetings, you are creating a bureaucratic motion in all three governments that is sustained year-round. It is not simply in advance of the one meeting. It's something that is sustained year-round. So I think this effort to trilateralize the very uncertain external security environment, and the fact that in Korea today, the country that is seen to pose the largest threat to Korea today is China by far. It's not Japan. It's not the United States. It's not even North Korea. It's China. I think for all these reasons, I would hope to see that what's been established now would continue.
I mentioned at the outset that that much of the region, that the U.S. government itself struggled with the conceptualization of international relations, and whether this was a region defined by a bipolar U.S.-China relationship or something more multipolar. And one reason I share your confidence about the Korean scenario is, I think it's fair to say, some of our friends in Seoul would disagree, but the Park Geun-hye and Moon Jae-in governments were positing their foreign policy on the bipolar model. And so strategic ambiguity was what they called their strategy, informally stay out of the US-China competition. And one thing I can see clearly in Australia is how active Korea now is with Australia. I was in India recently, you could see it in India. I think because of the challenges you're describing, there's a very broad recognition in all of our countries now that we have to harness this multipolarity, that the relationship is not, it's not just with the US that matters, it's not just US-China competition that matters, that the ability to shape a more positive environment, have options, depends on these relations. So there's a logic, I think, to continuing them.
Yeah, the only thing, I think that's right, Mike, and the one thing I would add to that is what was different, for example, between Park Geun-hye, who reached with Prime Minister Abe the Comfort Women Agreement, and President Yoon, is that previous conservative governments in South Korea still saw China as a way to get to North Korea, still saw China as a way to they felt they needed China as a way to engage with North Korea. And I think the current administration in Seoul is not interested in that algorithm at all, in part because they are not really interested in engaging North Korea. And second, I think they approach China with a great deal of skepticism about the role that China can play in terms of improving relations between the two Koreas. So I think for all these reasons, that's also what makes this administration in Seoul different from the previous one. Now, I should say that, should presidents change in Korea and the political winds shift, things might move more slowly than they do under Yoon. So what we saw under Yoon was really a very rapid change, right? Within the course of less than a year, we saw this rapid shift. And I think, that is agency. That is Yoon with a commitment to doing this. We hosted his transition team at CSIS, who was led at that time by the current foreign minister. And they were very clear at the time that number one, it was in the relation with the United States, and number two was the repair of the relationship with Japan. They were very clear about it right after they as they were preparing to come into office. So we saw this happen very rapidly under Yoon. I think, as I said, I think the trend lines will continue. They may move more slowly than they have under Yoon, but I think they will continue.
And these are new alignments that are not just based on diplomats in a room looking at the map and saying, let's do more with Australia or let's do more with India. There is some of that, but there's also an economic and a defense and a technology logic to these relationships. I suspect part of it's driven by de-risking and decoupling from China, friend-shoring and supply chain security. That's part of it, but also building national sovereign capabilities. I can see this clearly in Australia. The AUKUS agreement, Australia, UK, US agreement to build nuclear-powered submarines for the Royal Australian Navy and also work on advanced technologies like hypersonics and quantum. That could have been a US-Australia agreement, but the Australians wanted the UK in because they wanted a more diverse array of technology, but they also wanted the leverage with Washington. By trilateralizing it, they got more leverage with Washington. And in Australia, in our surveys at the center, 3/4 of Australians want a security treaty with Japan. So there's a very, very positive view of Japan. in Australia and in many, many countries in this region. There's also a logic on the defense and technology side. Australia needs Japanese investment in critical minerals so that more processing is done in Australia and not just China. Japan, when it develops strike capabilities, needs testing ranges. Australia has a lot of land and excellent testing ranges. The US and Japan need the posture opportunities, the basing and exercise opportunities. So there's a lot of concrete logic to this, including for Japan and Korea. Shirish, since I want to turn back to you to ask about the geopolitics for a minute. You know, as the US, Japan, Korea, Australia, the Philippines, the UK, and Europe are aligning more, we also see, as several people have mentioned, unprecedented alignment in recent years anyway, between Moscow and Beijing, and now very worryingly, Moscow and Pyongyang. And if you look at Chinese diplomacy in the Gaza war, more support for Hamas from China and Hezbollah and Iran than you would have seen. So this is not just about us. They are also aligning and maneuvering. Do you worry about or do you think we should prepare for a new Cold War, in effect? Two camps? Or do you think it's much more complicated than that?
More simplistically, if I may try to respond to the question raised by Mike, it would be, during the Cold War, the US was at the center, the so-called free world has been created, and that was about to expand to the world, and that has ushered in the globalization. And I deliberately use this phrase, the China and Russia, the allied, the coalition, and the other countries would join. And we cannot deny that such a strong camp is now about to be formed, and especially in Japan. Now, the word Global South is frequently used starting this year. I myself believe that Global South is not a useful phrase. We need to look at the regions and the newly emerging states. When you say Global South, internationally, what would be important would be not the developing countries, but handful of the newly emerging countries like India, Brazil, and those countries. So how to engage with these countries is what we need to think about. Now, about the ASEAN. Of course, the biggest is Indonesia in terms of population as well as the size of economy and also military expenditures. About 40% is the share for Indonesia within ASEAN. Next is Thailand, and then Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, about the same level in terms of size of economy and also military expenditures. So how to engage with these countries would also be critical. But when you look at South Asia, India, in terms of population as well as economy scale, 80% or more. So India is the hegemon in the region. So perhaps a different engagement would be required if we are to address South Asia. I forgot to mention earlier, there's one point that I would like to add. Now, domestic politics matter very much. For example, when you look at Thailand, looking at the political system right now, well, for now, they have been able to establish themselves, but I don't think they can last for 10 years. And Indonesia, it is at a turning point. And then about the Philippines and Vietnam. On the other hand, they are politically stable. And their security policies and macroeconomic policies are quite stable. So for these two countries, I believe you can feel secure and be able to deeply engage with them.
a basketball game, and we said China and Japan are going to play, and you can pick your team. And Japan picked the U.S., the world's most powerful country, India, the world's most populous and youngest major power, brought Korea over on the team, Australia, UK, Europe, all big athletes who play basketball a lot. And then China's team is North Korea, Iran, Russia, a bunch of guys who smoke cigarettes, don't even own a basketball. I mean, if you were choosing the teams, you wouldn't choose the team China has. Yeah. So is Xi Jinping driven by just purely ideology? What do you think he's thinking as he looks at his alignment? As you and I and Victor know, there are many scholars in China who don't think this is a smart way to choose a basketball team.
Yeah.
So what do you think is happening?
Yes. 全く
Yes, I agree completely with you. So at the end of the day, what is very important is, for example, between Japan and the US, Japan and Australia, Japan and the UK, and although at a different level, Japan and France, for example, quite a high level of mutual trust is there in these relationships. So we never think that our relationship will change overnight. However, China is challenging this kind of world. So if that's the case, then with which countries can China form a relationship? Until recently, I have been saying that China has only Joker to have a relationship with. So how can I say rogue state is also cooperating with China. But in any case, centering around the US, we have a free world. At the core, we have such a strength. So this is the other side of the coin we are seeing in China. And also for Japan, in 2010s, as somebody else said, during the Abe administration, we encountered a major change, not only in terms of security, but also in trade and others. So very clearly, we have seen a change of the grand strategy at that time. And that is continuing still even today.
Victor, I imagine that Kim Jong-un thinks this is a great team. Because North Korea hasn't had a team since the Cold War. And this is not quite the same team. It's not quite the same level of support. Kim Jong-un can't play Moscow and Beijing off against each other the way Kim Il-sung did in the Cold War. But there has never been such a convergence of powers hostile to the United States and South Korea and Japan, certainly in Kim Jong-un's lifetime. Does this make the Korean Peninsula more dangerous? Does it give him more room for maneuver?
So your basketball analogy, what I was thinking of when you were making it was that the big difference is that the Chinese side, like we bring basketballs to the game, but the Chinese side brings basketballs and they're also hiding guns and knives and baseball bats. So I think one of the big differences now in terms of Kim Jong-un, North Korea, and Russia is arguably for the first time in history, North Korea actually has some leverage because they need Russian munitions. The White House released satellite imagery that showed at least 300 containers of munitions going from North Korea to Russia by ship and then by rail. Our own satellite imagery showed on subsequent dates there are scores more of containers that are going from North Korea to Russia. So the North Koreans, I think, feel like they're in a much better position than they've been in the past. I think they feel like this is the way that Kim Jong-un recovers from the failed summit meetings with Donald Trump and then the 3-year COVID lockdown. But let me go back to something you said earlier, Mike, which is that, and this question about all of these multilateral, plurilateral groupings emerging now. Even for Korea as well, a couple of years ago, even when the Trump administration was creating the Blue Dot Network, the Clean Network, Indo-Pacific strategy, Korea was sort of isolated. They had self-isolated. They were not connected to any of these in Asia. And so we've seen a really active effort by Korea to connect to these, interest in the Quad, because of the unthinkable now becoming thinkable, a lot more proactive Korean interest in talking about Taiwan than we've ever seen before. We hosted for the first time at CSIS this fall a trilateral with the US, Korea, and Taiwan, actively talking about concerns about opportunistic aggression. And this is something I know that Japan is worried about as well. That is a contingency in the Taiwan Straits that also sees some sort of opportunistic aggression by North Korea on the Korean Peninsula to try to stretch the United States even further. These used to be very distant scenarios for Koreans, but now they're seen as quite concerning, and a willingness to talk more openly about these with Americans, with Taiwans, and with Japan.
When Joe and I was Assistant Secretary of Defense and there was a crisis in the Taiwan Straits region in 95, 96, the U.S. sent 2 carrier battle groups through the South China Sea with impunity. The Chinese strategy ever since has been to push back as far as possible, as you say, and to make that very, very visible to Korea, to Japan, to Australia, to the Philippines. There's a reason the U.S. and Japan are interested in training in Australia. There's a reason Australia thinks it needs undersea warfare capabilities. It's because the PLA strategy is to fight all up and down the first and second island chain and stretch us out. That's a big driver behind this consolidation. I have questions for each of you from our online audience, so I'll start with Shiraishi-sensei. The question is, how important is the Philippines geopolitically for the U.S. and Japan?
Now, on security issue in Japan, the first thing that comes into mind is the Taiwan contingency. But beyond Taiwan, there is Philippines. And in the South China Sea, for the security for the South China Sea, and also for Taiwan, Philippines is very important. That is without saying true. So Japan is providing the military equipment, support and assistance, and capacity building for Filipino Coast Guards. There are many things that Japan is already doing, but I think Japan should further increase assistance and support to the Philippines. There's one thing I would like to mention. For now, this is fine, but looking at the eastern part of the Philippines, when you look at the Pacific coastal side, the depth of the waters very deep, not only for the Philippines, but for Indonesia. In some way, we need to engage with Indonesia as well. In security terms, Japan and the United States and Australia, that is the US, Australia, and Japan, in that order, we are coming much closer to the Indonesia. But next year, when the government changes, we need to work with the Philippines together to approach Indonesia.
Question about South Korea's relationship with China. And the question is, why is South Korea worried about China? Is it military? Is it economic? Is it diplomatic? Is it cultural? Is it all of the above?
It's a big question. I would focus on 3 things under this particular government. The first is the threat of Chinese economic coercion. Here it's been felt in Japan. In Korea it was felt in 2016, 2017 when the United States put a THAAD battery in Korea, and the Chinese responded with a concerted and protracted economic coercion campaign that still continues actually to this day, although it's unspoken. The second, as I said earlier, is that I think Korea really now sees much more connection between a Taiwan Straits contingency and the and security of the Korean Peninsula. And I think this has only exacerbated recently because of this new cooperation between DPRK and Russia. And third, at least for the current government in South Korea, this government focuses a great deal on democracy, freedom, and values as the cornerstone of their foreign policy. And China is antagonistic to all three of those things, as well as the liberal international order. So I think there's a worry about Korea not of a choice between a U.S. order and a China order, but a U.S. order and complete disorder, contrary to what the Chinese put out. I think the Chinese put out a view of order. They've written it in documents and everything, but I don't think they have any intention to subsidize that order, which means it will lead to disorder. So I think for those three reasons, we've seen a very different view from South Korea with regard to China, very different from what we've seen in the past.
I want to end with predictions. The AUKUS grouping, the Quad, the U.S., Japan, Australia, U.S., Japan, Australia, Philippines grouping, all of these are providing public goods for the region. The Quad, for example, provided vaccines. When Victor and I were in the White House, the Quad was created to provide emergency relief. AUKUS provides technical and industrial and military capabilities. But none of these are security treaties where there's a commitment to act in the common defense. Those are still bilateral, U.S. Japan, U.S. Korea, U.S. Australia. So the prediction question is, if we have a Taiwan contingency, say something about, I think U.S., Japan are pretty clearly engaged in this. But say something about Korea, the Philippines, Australia, NATO, whatever country you want. And if one is they're involved as much as the U.S. and Japan, and two is they're involved diplomatically and economically, and three is they're neutral, they stay out. So sort of India, pick some countries if you could, and give me the number. One, they're right there as far as much as the U.S. and Japan are. Obviously, there may be geographic or capabilities differences, but in terms of the commitment, they will find themselves, as committed as Japan and the U.S. Or two, more distant but supportive economically and diplomatically, and three, they duck and cover. They stay neutral. So you can pick any countries you want that are in these groupings just to test what you think would happen in a contingency. じゃあ誰から？シャリシ先生。
はい、やっぱりですね、
Well, Europe, or should I say, different from the Western Pacific. On the Pacific side, a hub-and-spoke system continues to be in existence. So, from Japan's point of view, how to network them? And the Japan-US cornerstone, that would be solid, so it will not change. But for the past 10 years, Japan has strengthened our relationship with Australia, not only in security terms, but looking at energy transition. The LNG or coal import, Australia is the biggest the exporter. And as relationship progresses, the energy sector cooperation will be enlarged with Australia. So Australia is a very important country for Japan. The having second importance after United States.
Asia or the Philippines?
フィリピン、
With regard to the Philippines, actually, about 7 to 8 years ago, Maritime Asia versus Continental Asia, that is the title of the book I wrote back then. So in a nutshell, the conflicts in the future will be the conflict between maritime countries and continental countries. In terms of maritime countries, Japan should be engaged with Australia as well as the US. In that case, with the Philippines and Indonesia, we have to raise relationship as well in terms of coastal states, Vietnam and Singapore, Malaysia. So these countries has to be considered important as far as geopolitics is concerned, and also geoeconomically as well.
Or is interested in you, especially if you're in maritime Asia. And the Philippines and President Marcos seem to realize that danger. Victor, Korea or any other? You've done a study on Germany and other countries' alignment strategies, but what would your prediction be?
So, well, first, on your initial question, which I feel I didn't answer, was, and we were both asked to answer, it was the future of this networking. I think the future is bright. I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity here, and it's driven by two things. One is, right, a greatly deteriorating external environment in which insecurity is rampant. And two, relatively speaking, U.S. capabilities are not what they were post World War II. These two things, I think, create lots of opportunities for this networking to continue. With regard to these specific contingencies, so the way I look at it is that what's happening in the Taiwan Straits has created new dynamics in the way Korea looks at these plurilateral groupings and the role they play in a Taiwan Straits crisis. As I said, the major concern now is opportunistic aggression. What happens if something happens in Taiwan, this could easily spread to the Korean Peninsula, which causes the South Koreans to have a very different conversation on Taiwan. Before it was about how do we stay out, and now it's about rear area support for the conflict in Taiwan, but also the ability to maintain deterrence on the peninsula if the United States is engaged in the region. That then leads to another conversation about the role of United Nations Command and UN sending states. What role can they play in peacetime in deterrence on the Korean Peninsula? The second is, as you mentioned, Mike, earlier, this new DPRK-Russia relationship. It's my view that Kim Jong-un doesn't go all the way to Russia just for food, right, in return for munitions. So I think among the things he's looking for is nuclear submarine technology. I think that's what he's really looking for. And that creates a lot of discussion in South Korea about how can they contribute to this conversation on AUKUS? What role can they play in AUKUS? So, all these new opportunities are being created, unfortunately not by good things, but they're being created in a way that the United States-Japan alliance can really find opportunity in them.
Free peoples not previously connected on security are seeing the same things happening in their world. And Jake Sullivan, after the U.S. trilateral with Japan and Korea in Camp David, was asked, are you trying to create a NATO in Asia? And he said, no, we're not. And the U.S. is not trying to create a NATO, and it would be counterproductive to do that because all of us, including the U.S., have very, very strong economic relations with China, but also none of us are writing off China's future. And if you get to the point where you're creating a NATO, you're writing off a future with China, as the members of NATO essentially did with the Soviet Union. Doesn't mean you're predicting a war, but you get to a conclusion about what that relationship looks like, and nobody, including the U.S., wants to do that. On the other hand, as I pointed out in a foreign policy piece recently, 5 years ago, if we were on this platform and said Sweden and Finland will join NATO, and if we voted on it, 95% of people would have said, no, that'll never happen. So this networking is probably going to continue incrementally. It should rightly focus on capacity building, shaping the environment, providing public goods to developing countries. But it is an option, and it creates those networks. And I think that even though Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping are not responding in the way we want, it's good that they know that. And for now, though, we're still largely living in the bilateral alliance world. That's the main operating software for the security relationships. But what we used to call hub and spokes really now is becoming hubs and spokes. And Japan is probably the most important hub with its relationship with the Quad, with Australia in the trilateral strategic relationship, its membership in the G7. And so this future is going to be determined in this town to a significant extent in Tokyo. So thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you to our panelists for a really interesting discussion.
皆様ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. Once again, big applause for the panel.